Welcome back to our course on Outlook 2013. In this and the next few sections we're going to look at the basics of using Outlook 2013. Everything you need to know is in place now. If you're using a touch device, you should be able to manage all this using touch. You should know about keyboard shortcuts, understand the ribbon, the status bar and the quick access toolbar and so on. And what I'm going to do in these sections is to go through each of the main elements of Outlook 2013 reasonably quickly, just a couple of examples of the usage of each, just to get you really up and started so that you can start working with Outlook yourself. And then after that I'm going to start going through each of the subjects in much more detail. So for example, with email, we're going to set up an account in just a moment, and then we'll send one or two emails later on. We'll receive one or two emails, and I'll quickly go through how to reply to them and so on. But then later on we'll have a couple of sections totally devoted to dealing with email in much more detail. So let's get started. Now I'm going to take email as the starting point, so the first thing we need to do is something that we could have done right at the beginning, and that is to set up an email account. Now of course, if you actually need to create the email account in the first place, so for instance if you wanted a Microsoft account, you'd have to go and do that via Microsoft. If you wanted a Google Mail, a Gmail account, etc., or if indeed you use an account from work, you may have an account using the domain of your employer. Now what I'm going to try to do in this course is to cover several different types of account and what happens with them, how they look and so on. But initially I'm going to start with a straightforward Microsoft account. It's actually a Microsoft Live account. It's already created, it's been in existence for some time, it's got a few emails in it. One of the things I have to be very careful about on a course like this is not to include any really personal emails, or indeed to send or receive anything that I shouldn't. So the emails, I'm afraid, are a little bit on the boring side. We'll create one or two as we go along. They will also not be particularly personal, and I appreciate that many of yours will be, but for obvious reasons I mustn't sort of expose anybody else to the outside world in terms of emails they've sent me or emails that I've sent to them. So I apologize now if some of the emails seems a little bit stilted, but I'm sure it'll do the job. So we go into Backstage View. Now under account information on the info tab it says no account available. You probably remember when the course started that I did make the point that I wasn't going to set up an account then. You may well have done, in which case you may be sending and receiving emails already, but I have no account available for email at the moment. Note that when I installed Outlook, and in fact when you installed Outlook, if indeed you did, it wasn't pre-installed, you probably used an account then, probably a Microsoft related account, in order to register and activate your copy of Outlook. That is not to be confused with this. Even if you did that, and in fact I did, and I'll come back to that later on in the course, that does not mean that you're managing the email of that account in this installation of Outlook. At the moment in this installation of Outlook I'm not managing any email accounts at all, even though this copy of Outlook is activated using one of my Microsoft accounts. It's an important point to bear in mind. So I click on Add Account. Now we get to a very interesting situation, because one of the things that's happened over recent versions of Outlook is that Outlook has got better and better at interacting with existing accounts. In earlier versions of Outlook, when you wanted to start managing email from, say, one of your Microsoft accounts, you'd have to do quite a bit of setup. You'd have to know quite a lot about your account in order to make that work. Particularly over the last couple of releases of Outlook, it's become almost totally automatic. Unless you have a specific problem or a pretty esoteric kind of email account to connect to, you can almost always connect automatically to an existing account, provided of course you know the authentication information, usually the password. Now there are two options on this Add Account. The first one, Email Account, is the one we're going to use in this section. There are occasions when this won't work, and those occasions are getting rarer and rarer, and there may also be cases where you have some very specific setup to do. Later on in the course I'm going to demonstrate manual setup. because there may be an occasion when you do need to do a manual setup of an email account. I'm going to go through that with you later. But for this section, we're going to do an automatic setup. Now again, as we go through the course, I'm going to be connecting a couple more email accounts as well. So I'm going to identify my email accounts by some rather funny looking naming, just so that we don't lose track of which is which. So this account I'm going to call Toby Microsoft. That isn't actually my surname, by the way. Now I'm going to put in my email address. And having entered my email address, I now enter my password and then retype the password to make sure that I've entered it correctly. And when I'm happy with all of that, I click on Next. Now what will then happen is that Outlook 2013 will try to find the mail server settings it needs to set up this account. And as you can see, and believe me, this will almost always happen with a Microsoft account, it does find those settings. Congratulations! Outlook is completing the setup for your account and everything looks ready to go. Now having completed this, we've got a couple of options. One of the options here on the right is add another account. So if I wanted to now set up one of my other accounts, I could do that. If you have more than one email account to set up, then fire away and set up the next one. I can also check this box, and when I finish I'll go in to change the account settings. I'm not going to do that on this occasion. I'm going to show you the account settings, but via a different route. So that's done. I click on Finish and I have my first email account set up. Now, one of the most notable things here is that that email account now appears down here. I can see the name of that email account, and if I click on the little marker to the left of it, it will expand the set of folders related to that account. Now, for this email account, and in fact for each email account, by default I get an inbox, a drafts folder, a sent items folder, deleted items, junk mail, outbox and search folders. I'll talk about each of these later on. The most obvious one is the inbox, and this tells me that I've got 5 messages in my inbox. I'm going to come back and look at those messages a little bit later on. So the account toby.a@live.co.uk has got folders, and I can see those folders in the folders pane. Let's go into Backstage View again and note on the Info tab the Account Settings button. Click on Account Settings. Select the top setting, Account Settings, and that brings up a dialog that's quite similar to the one in the previous couple of versions of Outlook, in that you have a list of your email accounts. Now there are different sorts of accounts, such as RSS feeds, that we haven't looked at yet. We're going to look at later on. At the moment, primarily we're looking at email accounts, and there's one email account set up, toby.a@live.co.uk. The type is an Exchange Active Sync account. In previous versions of Outlook, as I mentioned much earlier on in the course, we use the Hotmail Outlook connector to handle this kind of Microsoft account. It's now completely handled by something called Exchange Active Sync. You don't really need to worry about what that means, but for those of you that are using Hotmail accounts or live.com or live.co.something accounts, Exchange Active Sync will be significant in that it will manage that for you. And if I select one of my accounts, I've only got one, and click on the Change button there, I can actually look at the settings for that account, and as I mentioned before, you could manually set these up. So you've got user information, server information and so on. Click on Next and you get access to a testing system and so on. Now I'm going to look at all that much later on in the course, so I'm going to leave that for now, but you can see in there the account settings for each of your accounts, and if like me you're going to finish up with more than one email account and perhaps some RSS feeds as well, this is the area you go to check the setup of everything and make sure that everything is set up correctly. From here you can also of course remove an account, and there are options to do things like repair, but more of that later. Now, from this point onwards in the course, I'm going to assume that you have at least one email account set up. I think for the vast majority of you, you'll use an account like a Microsoft account or a Google Mail account. And if you don't have one, they are free to set up. You have to go through a process of recording a certain amount of information, but they're pretty easy to set up. It's probably a good sort of account to run a course like this with, because you can maybe experiment a bit and throw away the emails and even close the account after we've finished. If you want to use a more complex account or some with some unusual features, then I hope it will be able to be set up automatically by what we've seen already. If you need to look at the manual setup, you're going to have to skip forward in the course, I'm afraid, because I'm not going to go through the manual setup yet, because I'm keen for people to be able to get on to start using Outlook using one of the more straightforward types of email accounts. So you may need to skip forward to account management later on in the course, and then perhaps come back to this area of the course when you've got at least one account set up. You are going to need an email account successfully set up from here if you're following the course. So that's it on this section. We're now going to move on to sending and receiving some email. I'll see you in the next section.